The cold steel cuffs snapped onto his wrists and Kane smirked. "What's the suit for your skin's still black like a slave's?" The insult was sharp, and the crowd exploded in flashes, dozens of phones raised and aimed at the scene. Marcus lifted his head and replied flatly, "The law's not your little game." Briggs stepped forward, slapped the badge on his chest and growled, "In this city, you need my permission just to breathe." A bitter laugh slipped out, blending with the phone lights thickening the air on the street, holding tight for the moment everything might flip. The suburban avenue stretched endlessly into the night, 2 rows of spindly trees casting shadows on the road like smeared ink stain. The night wind carried a chill, slipping through every crack in the leaves, sweeping along the dry trash that rustled across the sidewalk. The air was still broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the faint glow of yellow headlights washing over the pavement. Marcus Reed drove slowly, eyes calm and fixed ahead, his mind occupied with the stack of morning meetings and the files he needed to review. Everything passed quietly until the sudden flicker of red and blue lights flared from behind, followed by a siren that tore through the night like a blade. Marcus furrowed his brow slightly, hands tightening on the wheel, but his movements remained steady, the kind of composure only a seasoned driver would show. He knew exactly what those lights meant and understood that tonight would not pass quietly. The rearview mirror reflected the patrol car speeding closer, 2 figures inside, radiating aggression, the flashing lights pounding relentlessly as if to drown the whole street in brute authority. Marcus eased off the gas, guided his car toward the curb, tires whispering against the asphalt. The moment the car came to a stop, the space around him seemed to thicken, warning of the tension about to descend. A sharp whistle pierced the air as Officer Kane stepped out of the patrol car. His hand gripped a flashlight tightly, its white beam cutting straight through the glass. His face lit with satisfaction at the sight of a black man in a suit behind the wheel. His boots struck the ground with deliberate rhythm, each step loaded with menace. Kane leaned in, his eyes scanning from collar to face, then curled his lip into a smirk. "Nice car. Just steal it, boy." His voice slid out slick as oil soaked in contempt. The word boy wasn't casual. It was a slap in the face, a deliberate humiliation meant to scrape dignity raw. Marcus remained still, hands firm on the wheel, eyes locked straight ahead. He didn't blink, didn't bow his head, letting silence form an invisible wall around him. In that moment, he let the wind whistle through the cracked window, let the yellow lights sweep across his face, but refused to let the hate-laced words pierce any deeper. His silence wasn't weakness, it was chosen, a tempered steel forged through years in unforgiving environments. Kane's brow twitched, unsettled by the calm, because he was used to fear, used to lowered eyes when he stood in front of someone. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from behind. Lieutenant Briggs approached, noticeably taller and broader than his partner Cap, pulled low to shadow his forehead, eyes cold expression disdainful. He stopped right beside Marcus, gave him a once-over from head to toe, his gaze treating him like a defective item that didn't belong here. Briggs tilted his chin, slapped the shiny badge on his chest, and said firmly, "Out here power starts with the badge on our chest." The words dropped heavy like a hammer driving in a nail, tightening the already suffocating air. Marcus slowly turned his head, his eyes finally locking onto Briggs. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only a calm coldness like still water. That calm, unsettled Briggs he had expected cracks, a flicker of pleading, anything to reinforce his authority. Kane smirked and glanced at Briggs, a silent cue that it was time to escalate. He tapped the flashlight sharply against the window and snapped, "Out of the car. Let's see what Mr. Fancy Suit is doing out here tonight." The broken streetlight cast uneven patches of light across Marcus's face, highlighting tension beneath his calm. He lifted his hands from the wheel, movement slow but deliberate, and reached for the gear shift like a man bracing for battle. Time thickened, seconds dripping by like syrup, breathless and tight. Kane growled, spitting his words like blades. "You hear me, boy. This isn't the place to show off." Briggs stood close, one hand resting near his belt, eyes gleaming with mockery, his half-smile carrying the weight of menace. Marcus finally spoke, voice low but clear, each word hitting the pavement pavement with weight. "You've got the wrong guy." The sentence was short, but it landed like a rock dropped into still water, sending ripples across the night. Kane burst out laughing, the sound bouncing into the dark as he clapped Briggs on the back with mocking amusement. "Wrong guy. What's he think he is, some washed-up movie star?" Briggs didn't laugh. He leaned in close, hissed like venom into Marcus's ear. "To us, you're just a shadow out of place, and shadows always need to be erased." The wind rushed through the trees, carrying the damp scent of freshly paved asphalt. The avenue stood silent, just three figures under the pale yellow streetlights. Their shadows stretched long and distorted across the ground, tangled together in a scene strung tight with tension. Kane pulled the cuffs from his belt metal, glinting under the light voice, low and cruel. "Tonight's gonna be one you never forget." Marcus tilted his head, a flash of steel in his eyes, calm as deep water ready to surge. Briggs jerked his chin and gave the order voice solid as stone. "Get him out." The suburban road, once just a quiet link between the city and its peaceful neighborhoods, suddenly turned into an arena. Wind, light, and shadow blended into a backdrop for a collision between power and resolve. Marcus sat, still silent, but unyielding, while the two officers in front of him held on to the illusion that they controlled the outcome. They didn't yet realize that every steady breath he took, every calm glance, marked the beginning of a battle they had started but would not be able to finish on their terms. And in the stillness of the night, on a road nearly empty, the distant wail of a siren echoed like the opening note of a tragedy no one would ignore by morning. The quiet suburban road suddenly felt crowded under the weight of curious stares. As the siren faded, a few locals peeked out from diners, corner shops, and even the doors of nearby apartments cracked open. The yellowed street lamp cast a dim glow like a faded backdrop, lighting up the tense standoff between three figures. A group of students stepped out from a cafe, phones in hand, screens lighting up as they silently recorded every movement. The stillness of the night broke with the harsh stomp of boots as Officer Kane approached the car door and barked out of the car. The door opened. Marcus stepped out and Kane immediately grabbed his arms, the cold snap of metal, loud and biting as the handcuffs clamped onto his wrists. That metallic sound rang out through the dark, locking the surrounding eyes onto the scene, murmurs rising with a mix of unease and quiet outrage. Kane lifted his head toward the crowd, eager to frame the moment as a triumph. His gaze swept over Marcus, then he muttered with scorn, "What's the suit for? You think fancy clothes change your skin color?" The words sliced deep, not just at Marcus, but at every black person watching from the edges of the city's silence. Marcus stood tall, his hands pinned by steel, the chill biting into his wrists, but he didn't waver. His eyes held firm on Kane. His voice dropped low, each word slow and steady. "The law's not your little game." He didn't shout, didn't move, but the sentence hit like a stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. A few students glanced at each other, whispering under their breath. Phones, trembling slightly in their hands, caught between fear and the weight of witnessing something that would not easily fade. Lieutenant Briggs stepped forward now, each stride heavy and slow, his sharp eyes scanning the space like he was claiming control of the air itself. He stood directly behind Kane, lowered his head slightly, and spoke in a flat, cold voice, each word falling like a hammer. "In this city you breathe because we let you." The sound struck the pavement with finality, leaving no space untouched. These words weren't just an insult, they were a raw declaration of power, a belief that life and death in that moment were theirs to decide. Marcus lifted his head high, his eyes scanning the faces around him. An elderly man stood by the curb, frowning but too afraid to speak. A young woman pulled her son close, shielding him with her body, while staring straight at the scene. The students, holding phones, no longer hid them, their screens, glowing bright lenses pointed directly at the two officers. In the flickering streetlight, every harsh word spoken had been captured. Kane spotted the light, scowled, and snapped, "Turn it off. This isn't a place for your little filming game." But the students backed away slowly, phones still raised, and their silence was answer enough. The raised phones only made Kane more furious. He tightened his grip on Marcus, forcing him hard against the hood of the car. He hissed through his teeth loud enough for all to hear, "Tonight, I'll teach you our kind of law." The words came out like a sentence handed down with smug finality. Briggs stood nearby, arms crossed, watching coldly, then added a dry, deliberate scoff. Every sound from the two officers was like a spark dropped in dry air, thickening the tension to the edge of combustion. Marcus didn't scream. He looked directly at Kane, his eyes steady and deep. His earlier words still echoed in the minds of the onlookers. "The law's not your little game." That line made something twist inside a few of them, a sharp stab of injustice, the jarring contrast between the idea of protection and the blunt force of oppression. The phones kept recording, their lights steady, locking in each moment, each word preparing to become evidence fuel for tomorrow's truth. The scene didn't last long, but every second felt thick and slow. A gust of wind swept down the street, tossing scraps of paper, old newspapers spinning wildly like voices screaming on behalf of those too quiet to speak. Marcus stayed, pinned wrists bound, but his posture didn't break his head, never bowed. That silence to Kane and Briggs was an insult. They wanted weakness, wanted pleading, but what they got instead was a gaze like ice and a calm that challenged them both. Briggs glanced at Kane, lips barely moving, voice low enough for Marcus to hear. "One word from me, and he disappears in the report." The coldness in his tone revealed a system that believed it had the right to rewrite truth. Kane nodded with satisfaction, then turned to the crowd and shouted, "Back off police business." But no one moved. They just stood, watched, and kept recording. The crowd's silence became a blade of its own because the truth was being witnessed openly, undeniably. In that moment, Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Briggs's face. His gaze cut through the shell of authority, forcing the lieutenant to glance away for a split second. Even with cuffs on, even under pressure, that quiet resolve radiated a presence that demanded to be acknowledged. That night, the street was no longer just the site of a man's arrest. It became the stage for an uneven confrontation where insults had unwittingly drawn a stark line between raw oppression and a proud man holding firm to his dignity. And as Kane dragged Marcus a few steps forward, the clinking of chains joined the wind and the hum of idling engines, making it clear to everyone that this was not the end, only the beginning. The humiliation in the street didn't stop at cruel word. It had planted the seeds of a coming storm, one that even the two most self-assured men that night would be powerless to stop. The slam of the car door echoed like a sealed verdict, snuffing out the last flicker of fragile freedom. The red and blue lights from the rooftops spun across the windows, casting fractured patterns over Marcus's face, sharpening his features into something cold and somber. The air inside was tight, filled with the stench of old plastic sweat and stale cigarettes. Kane sat in the front seat, turned around with a sneer tugging at his lips, and spoke in a hoarse, mocking voice. "Like that leather seat, that's VIP treatment for people like you." He dragged out the words VIP and people like you, as if handing Marcus a twisted favor. Marcus sat still, his cuffed hands resting neatly on his lap, eyes fixed on the window to his side. His gaze pushed past the thick tinted glass bathed in red and blue reflections, as if searching through the darkness for silence itself. His face remained calm, unreadable, but the icy focus in his eyes revealed a quiet strength, making Kane's mockery feel like wind wasted on emptiness. Kane grew irritated at the lack of reaction and glanced toward Briggs, looking for a shared smirk. Briggs sat in the passenger seat, fingers gripping a cigarette, its smoke rising in thick spirals that blurred the already suffocating space. He took a long drag, then exhaled, slowly, releasing a thin stream before letting out a dry chuckle. "Sit still," he said, voice low and smooth like cold metal. "Oh, just another statistic in my report." The words came out slow, flat, with indifference, reducing Marcus to a number in a system built to tally, not see. Marcus shifted his shoulders slightly, eyes never leaving the window. Trees, blurred past streetlights, spilled yellow across a sleeping city, and the siren's echo filled the car like a haunting refrain. The weight pressing down wasn't just smoke or stale air, it was the presence of unchecked force hanging in every corner. Kane let out a rough laugh, shook his head like he'd already won some petty game, but behind it flickered frustration because Marcus's silence still struck like an unseen blow. The road stretched ahead, each turn flashing with red and blue bursts, leaving streaks of shadow and glare on the pavement. Marcus breathed steadily, his gaze fixed outward as if to remind himself that beyond this glass there was still a larger world, still law, still truth. He refused to let himself sink into their provocation. Kane slapped the back of his seat and snapped with irritation. "Quit acting proud. You're nothing here." Briggs kept smoking quiet, but cast a side glance at Marcus, a look that held a flicker of curiosity. Marcus knew every word they spoke wasn't meant to start a conversation, but to erode, to chip away at his composure. But he refused to give them that satisfaction. Every passing second inside the patrol car was a psychological test, a silent battle where insults were weapons and calm was the shield. Outside, the siren kept ripping through the night, causing house lights to flicker on one by one, shadows peeking from windows, watching the convoy pass. Their eyes were curious, uneasy, but quickly disappeared behind curtains out of fear. Kane leaned forward, face close, eyes narrowed, his voice heavy like lead. "Look around. No one's coming for you. Tonight, it's just me and him." He pointed to Briggs, and "We are the law." Marcus turned his head slowly, eyes locking with Kane, saying nothing but filled with cold resistance. That moment made Kane hesitate slightly, as if he'd run into a wall he couldn't push through. Briggs exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, the smell filling the space, and added like a closing statement. "Tonight he learns one lesson. There's no place here for anyone who thinks they've got power." The engine roared as the car swerved hard, the flashing lights painting Marcus's face in deeper streaks of shadow and glare. Time inside the car stretched. Every rattle of metal, with each bump in the road, sounded like a heavy knock against his mind. But Marcus stayed exactly as he was, eyes locked on the window, breathing steady while the officers flung every verbal blade they had. And it was that very stillness inside the suffocating air of the patrol car that unsettled them the most. The night outside went on the city asleep, but inside the cramped vehicle a quiet war was underway. The siren pierced the dark red and blue lights, blinked without pause, and Marcus sat still as stone, facing two men who believed they held absolute power. What they didn't realize was that with every second, every insult thrown, they were creating the evidence of their arrogance, unintentionally drawing a clear contrast, a man in chains holding his dignity, and two men in badges exposing the raw face of distorted authority. The car remained hot with smoke, the air compressed until every breath could be heard. Kane glanced in the mirror and saw Marcus, still unmoving fury, rising in him but unable to break loose. Briggs crushed his cigarette into the ashtray with a click, his eyes etched with contempt. The siren wailed on and the road seemed endless, with the three of them pulled deeper into a vortex of power, humiliation, and defiant silence. In that contrast, the night felt even more suffocating, and the story began to slip into a darker place where one more step might ignite something beyond return. The iron door slammed shut behind Marcus with a sharp clang, the sound bouncing off the long hallway and echoing back like a dry bell toll, confirming total isolation. The air inside the holding area reeked of dampness, aged walls, and years of rusted metal. The cell Marcus was led into was so small that every step echoed off all four walls, the tiled floor stained with old marks, and the flickering fluorescent bulb hanging from the ceiling blinked in and out as if testing the patience of of anyone trapped inside. The vertical bars stood rigid, cold, and coarse, sending a chill through any hand that touched them. The space already stifling thickened even more as Marcus entered, wrists cuffed, the blue-white light slicing across his face and tracing every sharp feature. He sat on the cold cement bench, back, straight eyes half closed. The calm in his posture stood in stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded on the street. Outside the small cell window, the sound of boots echoed, slow and deliberate steps drawn near. Kane appeared first, his face lit by the dim bulb eye sockets sunken and a crooked grin twisted with malice. He gripped his baton tightly, smacked it hard against the bars, sending out a piercing metallic clatter that made the cell tremble. "Tonight, remember this. The law here is this stick." His voice came out dry, every word forced through clenched teeth, shaped into a command as if his authority was the only thing allowed to exist in that confined space. Marcus remained still, eyes shut tight, breathing evenly. In what seemed like a moment of calm, he was counting his heartbeats, measuring each breath to hold on to composure, not to appear indifferent but to maintain control in the face of provocation. He had faced more dangerous situations before, but open humiliation, the blunt disregard for dignity, was always the kind of thing that tested a person's restraint. Marcus knew that 1 second of letting anger take over would drop him straight into the trap they'd set, so he kept his eyes closed, stayed silent, and let stillness become his invisible shield. That silence drove Kane to the edge. He was used to fear, to wide, panicked eyes, to stammered begging, to the trembling of those who stood before him. But here the man with cuffed hands sat like stone, unmoved by any of it. It was a slap Kane's pride. He clenched his teeth, banged the bars harder, hoping the screech of metal would crush the wall of silence Marcus held. But the more he did, the more he felt like a man flailing in vain. Another set of footsteps echoed deeper and heavier. Briggs appeared behind Kane, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the stained tile floor. He stepped into the room, arms crossed, eyes cold as stone, then spoke with a slow mocking drawl. "You look more like a beggar than a businessman." Briggs emphasized each word slow and indifferent, as if Marcus were a piece of trash he had stepped on by accident. No shouting, no need to raise his voice. Just one casual sentence carried the full weight of humiliation. Marcus opened his eyes. His gaze sliced through the lingering cigarette smoke like a blade, sharp and unwavering. There was no rage in his eyes, only clarity, and it made Briggs pause for a moment, shifting his head slightly to avoid meeting that stare head-on. Marcus spoke in a low, steady tone, each word landing on the tile floor like a shard of glass. "The weak are the ones who need to prove themselves with a stick." The sentence was simple, but it struck like a cold blow, freezing the already cramped room. Kane smirked, but his laugh sounded forced, the confidence behind it cracking. He had wanted to see a man break, to hear pleading, but instead a single line had made him feel small. Briggs scoffed, but a flicker of unease passed through his eyes because he sensed this defiance wasn't reckless. It was grounded in someone who knew exactly what he was worth. In a room thick with mildew, smoke, and flickering light, the silent standoff between the cuffed man and the two enforcers became more intense than any shouting match. Outside in the hallway, the steps of another guard passed by, faded into the distance, leaving the room to the three men and the tension hanging in the air. The fluorescent bulb flickered again, going dark for a few seconds before flaring back to life, casting distorted shadows across the floor. Those blurry streaks of light made the space feel colder, like a stage for a power play that had no script. Marcus kept his back straight, eyes locked on Kane and Briggs. His posture wasn't that of a prisoner, but of a soldier in a moment of stillness. Within his silence was something the other two couldn't ignore: complete self-possession. They had thrown their harshest words, used threats and mockery to break him, but the result was the opposite. They were the ones unsettled. The night outside stretched on wind, slipping through the narrow window slit with a soft hiss, as if whispering that the world beyond still existed, truth would not disappear. Inside this cramped room, the seemingly meaningless insults had unintentionally drawn a sharp contrast. Two men with badges clinging to violence to assert their power, and a man in cuffs, sitting silently, his eyes glowing like a slow-burning flame reflecting a strength that would not yield. And from that moment, the tension escaped the limits of the cell bars, seeping into the night, planting the seeds of a coming storm, one in which truth and justice would rise to reclaim their voice. The next morning, before the city sky had fully brightened, it was already stirring with unusual commotion. The road, leading to the district courthouse, usually crowded only with traffic, was now packed tight with curious onlookers. They gathered in clusters, murmuring eyes locked on the steps that led up to the large wooden doors. The faded white wall reflected the early sunlight, giving the whole scene a heavy, solemn tone. The whispers, mixed with hurried footsteps and the clicking of press cameras, building a sense that a major trial was about to unfold. Amid the stir, two figures emerged, followed by a man whose wrists still bore the marks of handcuffs, and in that instant the air in front of the courthouse thickened. Kane walked in front, his face smug, his hand gripping Marcus's arm tightly, dragging him forward like a prized trophy. Briggs followed behind, moving slowly, eyes scanning the crowd to be sure everyone could clearly witness the scene. Their pride in every step wasn't just a display of power, it was a way to feed the ego that believed they had successfully taken down a black man. Kane deliberately kept a brisk pace, forcing Marcus to stumble slightly, with each step exaggerating the gap between the enforcers and the one being led. A sharp whistle cut through the noise, and Kane tilted his head back, spitting out a sneering line, "Stand tall, let the world see what a classy criminal looks like." His words cracked through the space like a whip, both mocking and humiliating, causing a hush to fall over some in the crowd as they exchanged uneasy glances. But others laughed the twisted laughter of people used to seeing the powerless paraded as spectacle. Briggs said nothing, but the faint scoff curling at the edge of his mouth added another layer of shame. Marcus kept his step steady, his pace calm, his eyes never dropping to the ground or pausing on the pointing faces. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the national flag waving atop the courthouse. The early light hit the red fabric, and the wind gave it motion, casting a quiet, rhythmic ripple that mirrored the strange calm in his eyes. The man with cuffed wrists, rather than bowing to the shame, chose to look up at the symbol of justice, as if to remind himself that what was happening now was merely a small trial before a larger ideal. The crowd murmured a few phones lifted discreetly, cameras pointed at Marcus and the two officers. Quick videos were recorded, hands trembling but eyes steady, trying to capture this moment of injustice to bring it into the light of day. Someone whispered, "He doesn't look like a criminal." Another voice answered, soft but sharp, "Those eyes, not guilty. Looks more like a man testing the limits of patience." The murmurs spread like water through stone, seeping into the heavy atmosphere, making the two officers briefly uneasy, though they quickly masked it behind stiff expressions. The courthouse steps were tall and wide, each footfall echoing back as if confirming the weight of the moment. Kane kept yanking Marcus's arm hard, deliberately, making him stumble, trying to present the image of a weakened criminal before the cameras. Briggs maintained his smug expression, occasionally glancing up at the balcony, where several journalists stood with blinking cameras. To him, this was a chance to stamp their authority into public memory, to prove that the badge on their chest could turn anyone into a criminal regardless of their past or position. But Marcus's posture was the opposite of what they intended. He walked with steady steps, not resisting, not bowing his head. His eyes fixed on the national flag above, never meeting the mockery around him, letting the laughter and insults fall into nothingness. That image to the onlookers became a symbol of quiet pride that refused to bend. More phones were raised, no longer in secret but openly, and each glowing screen became a small beam of light shining on the truth they tried to hide. The murmurs grew louder. Some felt outrage at the blatant display of abuse, others a quiet fear at the clear misuse of power. An elderly man shook his head and sighed. "Looks too familiar. Decades and still the same." A young woman beside him gripped her phone tightly and said softly, "But this time feels different. Something in his eyes makes me believe something's about to break." No one answered, but several heads nodded silently. The courthouse's large wooden door creaked open, its hinges groaning, and light from the courtroom stretched out across the floor. Kane and Briggs, still full of pride, pulled Marcus through the threshold like presenting a piece of evidence. But in that very moment, what people saw wasn't a criminal dragged before the public. It was a composed, dignified man facing injustice with his eyes on the symbol of justice itself. The humiliation Kane and Briggs tried to sow became a double-edged blade. In front of the crowd, their arrogance exposed their cruelty, while Marcus's silence radiated a power that needed no word. The clips recorded that morning would not remain on phone memory for long. They would spread fast, and with them every scornful phrase from the officers would become proof of a night when power was twisted out of shape. Marcus stepped over the final stair, still looking up at the flag, and as his foot touched the stone floor of the courthouse, his calm became a quiet message. Justice does not live in the hands of the abusive, but in the resolve of those who refuse to break. The air outside trembled, whispers spreading quickly, and every eye followed him, knowing that from this moment forward the story would no longer be just an arrest but a chain of events that would shake the entire system. That morning, the small cafe just outside the university campus suddenly turned into a gathering spot for dozens of students. The scent of freshly ground coffee lingered in the air, mixed with whispers and the steady clatter of keyboard keys. Normally, this was a place for group study and casual chatter, but today the atmosphere was completely different. No one talked about homework or exams. Every eye was locked on a phone screen. The audio from videos played at full volume, shaking the cafe enough to make even passers-by pause. On screen, the shaky footage showed grainy flashes of yellow streetlights, but the moment was unmistakable. Marcus being pulled from the car, wrists locked in cold cuffs. Kane's voice blared through the cafe. "What's the suit for? You think fancy clothes change your skin color?" The line hit like a slap to everyone watching. Seconds later, Marcus appeared, lifting his head with calm eyes in the face of mockery. And though the screen was small, the outrage it sparked was massive. A student near the door spoke up, her voice trembling. "What year is it that this kind of blatant hate still happens?" Her friends all nodded, lips pressed tight, fire building in their eyes. The wave of emotion quickly turned into action. Every phone in the cafe became a tool of protest, spreading fury across the digital world. The clip was shared again and again, with likes and comments rising by the second. "Can't believe this is our city's police," one comment read. "If that were my father, I'd fight to the end," another wrote, filled with rage. Social media feeds began flooding with the image of Marcus, hands cuffed, eyes locked on the flag, accompanied by captions demanding justice. In a corner booth, a group of students talked heatedly. A curly-haired guy leaned on his chin, voice laced with bitterness. "This scene's no different from the past, just with new uniforms." The remark brought a hush over the table, but also a shared understanding that they were witnessing a terrifying echo of history. A girl quickly opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, reposting the clip with a caption, "This isn't just an arrest, this is public humiliation." Those around her shared it eagerly, pushing the outrage further faster. Not long after, the hashtag #JusticeForMarcus appeared and shot to the top of the trending charts. Bold captions paired with the image of Marcus standing proud beneath the national flag spread like wildfire. From student groups to major social forums to breaking news outlets, the hashtag took off. Is this the justice we're supposed to believe in? The question echoed everywhere, turning the previous night's events into a flashpoint for an entire online community. Inside the cafe, voices grew louder. Some couldn't hold back and called friends, their voices breaking with anger. "I can't stay silent anymore," a student said suddenly, standing, eyes burning bright. He opened his phone and quickly sent the clip to a local newspaper's email. His fingers trembled not from fear but from determination. They need to see this. he muttered. His action drew encouragement from those around him. They shook hands, their eyes shining with the belief that they had just sparked something important. Outside, the city moved along with its usual rhythm. People packed the streets on their way to work, buses stopped to pick up passengers, and breakfast stalls steamed with heat. But inside the small cafe, a storm was forming. It started with a few blurry clips with the outrage of young people, but quickly grew into a powerful wave. Each share became a small surge joining the larger tide, pushing the truth beyond the limits of the jail cell walls. At a table by the window, a middle-aged man sat silently watching the video on his son's phone, his tired eyes catching a quiet light. He set his coffee down and nodded gently as if to say justice could still burn from the spark of a younger generation. Beside him, a middle-aged woman bit her lip, eyes misty, and let out a sigh. But in that sigh was relief. At least this time it had been recorded and would be hard to bury. These reactions blended into the cafe's air, adding gravity to the moment. The clip from that cafe didn't stay within the university grounds. Within hours, it had swept across the city, then beyond its local borders. National media platforms began posting early reports, brief but attention-grabbing. Online headlines read, "Police mocking clips, sparks outrage," followed by a flood of angry comments. Some independent journalists quickly reposted the footage, emphasizing it as undeniable evidence of abuse of power. In the cafe, the sound of typing didn't stop. Many students were writing long posts, breaking down every detail of the video, each word, each expression. They weren't just angry. They wanted to understand to show this wasn't an isolated incident, but the result of deep-rooted bias. These pieces spread quickly, creating a new current of information, adding substance to the force of the footage. As the morning wore on, the hashtag #justice for Marcus was no longer just a trend. It had become a symbol, a collective rallying cry that everyone online had to see. Photos of Marcus looking up at the flag atop the courthouse spread alongside the caption, "Those eyes didn't flinch." An international news outlet even reached out for more details, a sign that the story was crossing national lines. In that cramped cafe space, everyone felt they were standing at the center of a turning point. It was clear to all that the clip didn't just expose the humiliation of one man, it struck at the roots of a larger social issue. And when one student pressed send, delivering the video to a newsroom, the door to truth swung wide open. From that moment on, the story no longer belonged to Kane Briggs or the officers in the dark. It became a story shared by the entire community, by millions, waiting for justice to finally be called by its name. That morning, the local newsroom glowed more from the light of screens than from the sun outside the windows. Dozens of monitors, big and small, displayed the same footage: Marcus being dragged from his car, wrists clamped in steel cuffs, and Officer Kane's clear voice shouting, "What's the suit for? You think fancy clothes, change your skin color." The clip had long since left the phones of students in a cafe. Now it was everywhere, shared by countless accounts from unknown users to high-profile influencers. Journalists, usually calm in their daily routines, now sat restless, each new headline like fuel thrown onto a spreading fire. Major media outlets jumped in fast. One national news channel cut the clip with a red banner headline, "Police Overreach or Distorted Justice." Another ran a special segment replaying every second in slow motion, zooming in on Marcus as he looked up at the flag above the courthouse, then cut into Kane's smug expression. The anchor, serious and composed, stated clearly, "This is no longer just an arrest. This is a reflection of how justice is carried out." What had started in a student cafe had become the center of a national debate. A young reporter in the corner typed furiously, eyes locked on his screen. His article opened with a line that made everyone in the newsroom pause. If they can do this to him tomorrow, it could be us. The piece went live, and W, within 10 minutes, had thousands of shares striking a nerve of fear and fury buried deep within the community. His words rang like an alarm bell, reminding everyone that this wasn't just an insult to Marcus, it was a warning to anyone whose skin appearance or life didn't fit the comfort zone of those who wear the badge. Meanwhile, the phones at the police department rang without pause. Dispatchers scrambled to transfer calls, overwhelmed by voices laced with outrage. How do you explain the video? We want an official statement. Are you still protecting citizen? The flood of questions came fast and relentlessly, leaving officers unable to keep up. Outside the station, a crowd began to gather, holding hand-painted signs demanding transparency and justice. Public pressure rose so quickly that those used to cover-ups and spin had no time to react. Briggs, sitting in the break room, still wore a calm expression. He crossed his legs, cigarette in hand, lips curled into a half-smile. People online just scream they won't touch me, Briggs said, his voice soaked in contempt. He believed in the shield that had protected him for years, convinced the online storms would pass, the public outrage would tire out and fade. Kane stood nearby, nodding at first, but his eyes betrayed unease. He glanced at his phone screen where thousands of angry comments kept pouring in, and though he tried to hide it, a sense of dread stirred in his chest. Back in the newsroom, the energy was relentless. The chief editor stood in front of the digital board displaying real-time interaction stats. The numbers were surging, the chart shooting upward like an arrow. "We've never seen viral speed like this," he said, a mix of awe and urgency in his voice. Reporters huddled, deciding to dedicate an entire segment to tracking the story, reaching out to first-hand witnesses. Several of the students who recorded the video had already received interview requests and accepted immediately, knowing the truth needed to be told in their own words. Articles, reports, and opinion pieces rolled out one after another, all converging on the same point: blatant abuse of power and the unwavering dignity of Marcus Reed. His image, eyes, calm and steady beneath the flag, was chosen as the cover photo for many online publications. Captions like "The eyes that wouldn't bow" and "a symbol of truth in the face of injustice" only fueled the growing outrage. Across cities, people began gathering in small groups, holding up handmade signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and live streaming their protests. The crowds grew, the chants rose, turning the event into a full-fledged social movement. At the police station, younger officers whispered in the hallways. They didn't dare speak out openly, but their anxious glances and avoidance spoke volumes about the cracks forming inside the force. Some quietly read updates on their phones, hiding the screens whenever a superior passed by. The usual air of obedient silence had been replaced by a quiet chaos shaped by outside pressure and internal doubt alike. Briggs, still leaning back in his chair, believed time would blur it all. But he didn't realize that outside each share, each post, each image was turning him into the face of public outrage. His presence, next to Kane in the video expression, cold, unrepentant, had become undeniable evidence of complicity. There was no path left to retreat, and though he hadn't yet grasped it, the fury now swelling across the public had become a wave large enough to drown anyone who thought themselves untouchable. That morning, inside the newsroom, phones rang non-stop, and the servers kept flashing overload warnings from the surge in traffic. A young editor stared at the newsfeed and murmured, "This isn't just a news story, it's a call to action." And that call echoed beyond the glass walls, reaching every street, every rooftop, every person who was watching. The wave of outrage was no longer just a floating cloud on the internet. It had become a real storm, sweeping across the city and ready to tear down what was once thought untouchable. Within the crowd, the young journalist's question echoed, "If they can do this to him tomorrow, it could be us." And that single question turned anger into unity, strangers into a community, a short video into a movement. From the small local newsroom, the storm called justice began to spread, and no one, not even Kane or Briggs, could stop it. That morning, outside the police department gate, the scene was unlike anything before. The crowd kept growing. Reporters pressed in tight microphones held high, long camera lenses aimed directly at the closed steel doors. The air was thick with noise from journalists calling to one another, citizens whispering and arguing, camera flashes firing in rapid bursts, all blending into a loud pulsing wave that filled the entire block. Handwritten signs had started appearing too, with bold red letters shouting, "We want justice, don't hide the truth, justice for Marcus." The crowd pressed up against the hastily placed barricades, every face lit with anger and expectation. Inside the building, the main hallway felt so heavy that every footstep echoed like it was hitting stone. The emergency meeting room was fully lit, long fluorescent bulbs casting a pale white glow across the table where senior and mid-level officers sat in silence, faces, grim eyes, dark. At the far end of the room, the large screen played the same clip on repeat, shaky footage that still clearly showed Marcus being dragged from the car, held down with Kane's voice cutting through. "What's the suit for? You think fancy clothes change your skin color." Each time the audio played, it was as if an invisible hand tightened around the entire room. The department's spokesperson, a man usually composed and practiced in front of cameras this time, showed clear signs of strain. He clutched a folder of notes, sweat trailing down his temple. His voice trembled, trying to sound steady but failing. "We are investigating." The short, hollow statement echoed through the still air, carrying no weight, only making the tension worse. Every eye turned toward him. Some officers shook their heads, some sighed quietly, others stared down at the table, unwilling to meet the truth just repeated on screen. Kane sat off to the side, arms folded, leaning back like this was just another routine meeting. His gaze drifted out the window where the harsh midday light cut through the thin curtains. He smirked, then leaned toward the officer beside him and whispered just loud enough, "It'll all blow over by tomorrow." In his mind, public outrage always faded, always gave way to tired silence. He believed this would be the same, that with enough time it would all disappear. But that confidence didn't spread. A few younger officers glanced his way, eyes uneasy, because outside the anger wasn't fading, it was rising. A young officer sat at the end of the table, his face tense, hands tightly clasped together. He looked up, his voice soft but clear in the silence. "You guys probably arrested the wrong man." The words pierced through the heavy air like an arrow, making everyone turn. Some frowned, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few avoided eye contact altogether. That truth had lingered in many minds, but no one had dared to speak it. And now that it had been said out loud, the room cracked open with the weight of what everyone had tried to bury. Briggs sat at the head of the table, his usually stone-cold expression turning dark. He set his half-burnt cigarette in the ashtray, slowly raised his head, and let his eyes sweep across the room. Suddenly, he slammed his palm onto the wooden table, a heavy sound that shook the nearby glass and scattered papers onto the floor. The noise jolted everyone. Briggs shot to his feet, growling, each word landing like a blow. "Right or wrong, he's just another black guy we arrested." The venom in that sentence slashed through the air, leaving behind a chilling silence. The room sank into a deathly quiet. Eyes darted, faces went pale. The spokesperson clutched his notes tighter, eyes flicking around the room, unsure how to respond. The young officer looked down, his hands trembling, clenched so tight they turned white. Rage flared inside him, but he stayed silent, blocked by the wall of power Briggs represented. Kane, meanwhile, burst out laughing, taking the comment as confirmation of his own stance. He patted Briggs on the shoulder, nodding with smug approval. But even in his grin, his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, because he knew millions outside had seen the truth and none of them would let it go easily. Outside the glass windows, the crowd's chant echoed, "Justice for Marcus. Justice for Marcus. The shouting spilled into the building, mixing with the soft clicks of camera shutters, turning the meeting room into a pressure chamber caught between two forces, the oppressive power within and the storm of outrage outside. Every word Briggs had just spoken, if leaked, would only throw more fuel on the fire. But even within those four walls, it had already cracked the foundation of the institution. The silence lingered heavy like thick fog. The younger officers glanced at one another, their eyes filled with confusion and resolve. They knew this storm couldn't be stopped now, and they also realized that what Briggs said wasn't a slip, it was the truth, deeply rooted in the very structure they served. The emergency meet-in room was no longer a space for strategy, but a mirror reflecting the fracture within where each person had to ask themselves which side they stood on. And while Briggs stood there defiantly believing he had just asserted his authority outside, every chant, every camera, every keyboard typing furiously was helping turn those venomous words into a verdict delivered by public opinion. No one in that room could have imagined that the very anger he let slip today would become a turning point, the moment that pushed the storm outside beyond control. That afternoon, in a small law office tucked away on a narrow streetlight from an old window, fell across towering stacks of files. The piles of paper on the desk, mixed with the smell of old documents and cold coffee, created a heavy yet familiar atmosphere for those who work with the law. Maya, a young attorney, sat amid the sea of paperwork, her eyes lit with determination. She had just received word of the case stirring public outrage, and without hesitation she decided to take it on because in her mind, justice was not something to be negotiated. Marcus was brought in to meet Maya in that modest setting. He sat in a wooden chair across from her, his eyes still carrying the calm that had made the crowd outside the courthouse freeze. Without saying much, he spoke briefly, his voice low and resolute. "I don't need a defense. I need the truth." The words made Maya pause, her hand stopping over the stack of documents. In that moment, she realized the man before her was unlike any client she'd met. He wasn't there to beg for rescue, but to affirm that the truth was the only weapon he intended to use. Maya tilted her head, studying him. In his eyes, there was no fear, no sense of helplessness, only an uncanny certainty. She understood that if she treated this like just another case, she would never grasp its full weight. Outside, public outrage was exploding. The press was scrambling, and every phone was capturing moments to broadcast online. But here in this small office, she was face to face with the eye of the storm, a man whose single sentence could become a rallying cry. The stacks of files on her desk belonged to other lawsuits, but once Marcus entered, they no longer seemed to matter. Maya set down her pen and leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "Mr. Reed, if you want the truth to come to light, we need to prepare thoroughly. The truth needs evidence, and it needs to be defended through the legal system." Marcus gave a small nod, his gaze unwavering, as if he already knew this path would be steep and had no intention of turning back. Outside the window, the rush of city traffic filtered in a reminder that the world never stops moving. But in this cramped room, the air had compressed into a quiet vow. Maya picked up a new file, flipping quickly through its pages, her eyes scanning for gaps. She knew what she was about to face wasn't just a courtroom hearing, it was a battle against a system long used to siding with the powerful. And her companion in that fight, the man sitting silently before her chair, was now the center of it all. In that moment, between walls stacked with files and dim light filtering in, a quiet connection was formed. Maya didn't need Marcus to say anything more. The resolve in his eyes spoke louder than 1,000 words. She took a deep breath, gathered the papers, and said softly, like a vow, "If you choose the truth, I'll be the one to give it a voice." Marcus stayed still, his face calm, but the glint in his eye revealed he had found an ally in what had been a solitary fight. From that point on, the story was no longer just about an unjust arrest, but about two people stepping into the storm to expose the face of power. Maya sat in silence for a few seconds after Marcus left the office. The soft click of the door closing felt like a turning point. A strange urgency stirred inside her, a mix of unease and curiosity. That man was unlike any client she had ever met. No pleading, no blame, no avoidance. The way he said, "I need the truth," was too sharp and composed, as if he were hiding something far bigger than the arrest. Maya sensed something buried beneath Marcus's identity, a layer that, if peeled back, could reveal a truth powerful enough to shake the entire city. She glanced around the office, the old case files stacked high against the shelves, the yellowing papers filled with dense writing. Suddenly, it all felt irrelevant. Maya raised her hand to her temple, thoughts racing. Marcus's calm wasn't empty bravado. It was the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who he was. The more she thought, the more convinced she became that he carried a deep secret, a truth the police hadn't anticipated. If she couldn't uncover it, the case would spiral into a cycle of blame and denial. She stood and pulled open the heavy metal drawer, the metallic clank echoing through the quiet room. Files flipped quickly, thick covers hid in each other, specks of dust rising in the sunlight. Maya searched the identity records, flipping page after page, her eyes scanning names, addresses, occupation. Occasionally, a familiar name made her pause, but she pushed it aside, none of them connected to the man she had just met. The air in the room thickened by the minute, the ticking wall clock pressing forward. Maya bit her lip. Marcus's voice echoing in her mind, "I need the truth." The words felt like a command, one she couldn't walk away from. When her hand reached a thick file clipped in a dark blue cover, her heartbeat quickened. The name in the top left corner stood out, and Maya's eyes widened. With every line in the file, the room seemed to freeze, and a wave surged through her chest. She dropped into the chair, took a deep breath, and tried to steady herself. The veil of secrecy around Marcus had begun to lift, and what she had just uncovered would undoubtedly shift the entire course of the case. Maya gently closed the file, her hand slightly trembling but her eyes burning with clarity. She knew she had found the key, and it wasn't just information about a person, it was the missing piece that would force an entire power structure to confront the truth. In that still moment, Maya told herself she needed to brace for the impact, because once this came to light, no one would be able to turn away anymore. That morning, the courtroom was packed, not a single seat left. The rows of public benches stretched long, crowded with curious, outraged, and intrigued faces. Cameras were set up everywhere, red lights blinking to indicate the hearing was being broadcast live, every glance, every word instantly reaching the outside world. The tension was so thick that even a slight cough seemed to shake the entire room. At the front podium, Kane stepped forward with a confident face, his swagger suggesting the entire place was his stage. He stood tall, adjusted his collar, and spoke clearly, his voice echoing. "He was a suspect. We were maintaining order." The words stunned the room, not because of their weight, but because of how blatantly Kane twisted a violent act into a duty. Whispers rose from the audience brows, furrowed a few people shaking their heads in disbelief. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes. Recorders pointed at the podium, and cameras zoomed in on Kane's face, capturing every smug detail. Kane kept his half-smile eyes darting sideways as if daring anyone to challenge him. He believed his statement, no matter how false, would be accepted, because that's how the system had always worked. Across the room, Marcus sat still, hands resting neatly, his face unreadable. But as Kane finished speaking, Marcus slowly stood his movement, calm but deliberate. The entire courtroom fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Under the harsh glare of overhead lights, his figure stood tall, steady as a pillar. His eyes scanned the room from the judge's bench, the rows of reporters to the tense faces in the crowd. With just one look, the air seemed to freeze, a heavy silence settling, as if everyone were waiting for something that could change everything. That gaze held no anger, no fear, but radiated a quiet authority that defied explanation. It made some in the audience straighten their backs and those wearing badges glance away. Marcus didn't speak immediately, because his silence alone in that moment created immense pressure, as if the room itself was bracing for a shift. The cameras slowly turned toward him, zooming in on every detail. And through those lenses, Marcus's image was carved into the center of the unfolding storm. No one yet knew what he would say, but his presence and that gaze alone were enough to tilt the entire hearing in a new direction. Kane, standing at the witness podium, frowned slightly, his hand tightening the confidence he had flaunted now starting to crack. Briggs, seated nearby, bit his lip hard. His eyes darted to Marcus with visible caution. Behind her, client, Maya clenched the case file in her hands, her heart pounding, knowing this moment stood at the threshold of a historic shift. And as Marcus let his eyes sweep across the room once more, everyone present could feel that what he was about to say wouldn't be just an answer, it would be a flame set to the curtain of lies. Marcus stopped dead center in the courtroom, the prolonged silence slowing every heartbeat. Then he reached into his inner jacket pocket, his motion decisive but calm, the entire room holding its breath. When he pulled out a gleaming badge, the overhead lights caught it and made it flash like a mirror reflecting truth. Marcus raised it high for all to see and spoke in a deep, resonant voice, unhurried yet powerful enough to drown out the noise. "I am Chief Marcus Reed." The words landed clean and hard like a hammer striking a table, slicing straight through the web of excuses just spun. For a brief second, the courtroom sank into heavy silence, then erupted. Murmurs surged into a wave of noise, reporters shouting, chairs screeching against the stone floor. Some people jumped to their feet, cameras all swinging toward Marcus Fletcher's, firing in rapid bursts, flooding the charged air. The crowd buzzed with disbelief. "He's the chief of police? No way." Then what did we really see in that clip? The shockwave tore through the courtroom like a bomb that had gone off in a space once used to solemn order. Kane froze where he stood, his once smug expression drained pale. His lips moved, but no words came out. His trembling hand was clutching the edge of the podium as if to stay upright. The arrogance he'd flaunted was gone, replaced by a face stiff as stone. Briggs, seated in the witness box, stared wide-eyed, paralyzed, a chill crawling down his spine, making it hard to breathe. Marcus's declaration had struck them like a verdict, without a judge, reducing the two once proud men to silent mannequins amid a sea of voices now shouting for justice. Maya sat in the back, her hand trembling on the case file, but her eyes blazed with fierce determination. She knew this moment was the turning point, the reversal no one could stop. On the judge's bench, the magistrate frowned, striking the gavel repeatedly to restore order, but the dry pounding couldn't drown the eruption. Each camera lens kept capturing Marcus standing tall, the badge in his hand, gleaming like undeniable proof. The packed gallery erupted in applause, voices shouting over the sound of phones ringing out of control. The courtroom, once expected to hold a seemingly minor case, had now become the stage where truth was laid bare. In the sharp glint of Marcus's eyes, every earlier justification lost meaning. The pale faces of Kane and Briggs marked the end of arrogance, and the public outside would never forgive. The hearing exploded into shockwaves, but at its center, Marcus remained upright, his gaze fixed forward like a man ready to take on the storm to bring justice into the light. Inside the main conference room of the police department, a heavy atmosphere hung over everyone like a soaked blanket. The bright white lights did nothing to lift the gloom that had settled in. On the long table, stacks of files mixed with torn papers lay scattered evidence of the chaos from the past few hours. Every eye turned toward the head of the table, where a senior commander sat upright, his face, taut eyes bloodshot with rage. His voice came out in a hoarse growl that echoed through the room. "Do you know what you've just done?" The question cut like a blade, silencing the entire room, no one daring to breathe too loudly. The lower-ranking officers sat frozen, some staring at the floor, others exchanging anxious glances. Since Marcus Reed had pulled out his badge and revealed his identity, the entire system had been flipped upside down. The usual excuses sources could no longer cover the truth, and the public had seen everything with their own eyes. Now, there was no way to pacify the outrage outside. The commander hurled a report folder onto the table, scattering papers everywhere. It was the incident statement drafted by Kane and Briggs, a clumsy piece of fiction that painted Marcus as a hostile suspect. "This is what you call a report," he hissed, eyes burning into the two men who sat with heads bowed. Another officer stepped forward carrying a few newly verified files from the internal review team and placed them on the table with a grim expression. A glance was all it took to see the blatant discrepancies. Times, locations, and testimonies were all distorted, turning the victim into a perpetrator. Red ink covered the pages from the internal investigation team, every lie underlined, every error exposed, leaving no room for cover-ups. The room fell into tense silence, broken only by the flipping of pages and the rapid tapping of pens on the tabletop. Everyone knew the fabricated report had collapsed completely, and there was no way back. Kane sat to the left, hands resting on his knees, palms slick with sweat. He stared down at the tiled floor, avoiding his superior's gaze, but his quickened breathing betrayed the panic taking over. Briggs kept his face cold, but his hand was clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Neither of them spoke, knowing any word now would only fuel the flames. The other officers, once silently complicit, now dared not say a thing. They knew the situation had spiraled beyond control, and the wave of public outrage outside was crashing straight into the police department's doors. The commander leaned forward, eyes sharp, as if trying to pierce through every layer of pretense. He spoke each word with deliberate weight, making it clear that this mistake didn't just damage individual reputations, it shook the entire structure. The truth had been exposed to the public, and any attempt to hide it now would only fan the flames. In the room, thick with the smell of sweat and cigarette smoke, the clatter of the ceiling fan made the air even heavier. No one dared speak, sensing they were in the eye of a storm where even the smallest move could send them spiraling into the abyss. That emergency meeting was no longer a search for a way out, it had become an internal reckoning. Every word, every folder flipped open, pointed to one undeniable fact: the police department had demeaned itself through blind actions. Outside, public outrage kept mounting, and the ##justice4 Marcus climbed to the top of the charts. Everyone in the room understood that this shock wouldn't end with one meeting. It would keep spreading, and no one could say when it would stop. In the stifling silence of the room, a voice rose from the end of the table, prompting everyone to lift their heads. It came from a young officer, his face still carrying traces of hesitation, but his eyes were bright and steady. He stood up, placing his hand on the scratched wooden table, his voice not loud but clear enough for every word to echo. "I believe everything Marcus Reed did and said was right. He's not a criminal. He's a victim of the arrogance within this very system." The statement landed like a hammer blow, and eyes that had been still now widened with surprise. A few people gasped, chairs shifted slightly, and Kane furrowed his brow mouth agape in disbelief. The young officer's courage didn't stop there. He went on, voice growing firmer, his hand now clenched into a fist. "If we still claim to stand for justice, we can't let the truth stay buried any longer. Mr. Reed deserves respect, and the actions of our fellow officers deserve condemnation." His words sent a jolt through the room like a current running through each person. Several younger officers bowed their heads, in thought flickers of agreement in their eyes, though none yet spoke. But even that silence had changed. It was no longer rooted in fear, but in the tension of something about to break loose. Briggs sat at the head of the table, his usual cold expression now cracked. For the first time, the shell of authority that once seemed unshakable began to show signs of fracture. His eyes bulged, face pale, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles beneath his skin pulsed. He was used to being obeyed, used to silence and cover-ups, but today, right here in this room, a voice had risen publicly against him. The arrogance he had worn like armor for so long was suddenly stripped away, leaving behind an emptiness and unease he could no longer conceal. At that moment, everyone seated around the table realized one thing: the balance of power had shifted. Briggs, though trying to maintain a firm exterior, showed eyes that had lost focus, a faint tremble in his hand as if searching for something to hold on to. The young officer's words weren't some grand declaration, but their simple truth shook the very foundation Briggs had long depended on. The emergency meeting room was no longer a place where he imposed authority, but a battlefield where oppressive power had for the first time been shaken by a flash of courage. That flash, small yet blinding, opened a path for other voices ready to rise, stripping away the mask Briggs had believed to be untouchable. Inside the cold room of the disciplinary committee, the white fluorescent lights cast a pale hue over everyone's faces, turning the space into a stage for the bare truth. A long table at the center was covered in documents, and at the far end of the room, a large screen stood ready to replay the clip that had shaken the public. The air was still broken only by the shifting of chairs and the soft tapping of pens on the table. When the signal lit up, the screen replayed the scene of Kane and Briggs dragging Marcus out with the degrading words, "Wearing a suit for what you think. Fancy clothes change your skin color," echoing, stretching on, making those present shudder. The camera zoomed in on Marcus's calm eyes, a stark contrast to the arrogance of the two uniformed men. Whispers rose. A few committee members leaned in to speak quietly. Some frowned, others tapped their pens harder. Then the witnesses entered a group of students who had filmed the clip. They placed a phone on the table along with a copy of the original footage to verify authenticity. One of them, voice still shaky but firm, recounted everything they saw that night during the traffic stop. Their account, combined with the footage, wiped away the smirks that had lingered earlier, replacing them with heavy silence. No one in the room could deny the evidence laid bare before them. Maya sat across the room, back straight, eyes fixed on every frame. When the screen faded to black, she stood, her voice ringing out, not loud, but every word sharp. "Is this law enforcement or the distortion of justice?" The question had cut through the air like a blade. Committee members shifted because it wasn't just a question for the two officers, but for the entire system present in that room. Maya didn't stop. She tapped lightly on the file in front of her eyes, locked onto the opposite row where Briggs sat frozen and Kane kept his head down. The room stayed silent, everyone aware that this moment was not just about clarifying facts, but about deciding whether justice still held meaning. The harsh white lights revealed every crease on the faces of veteran officers, but in the eyes of some younger ones, a spark of resolve had begun to flicker. They knew the cover could not continue because footage and testimonies had built an unshakable wall of truth. Maya sat back down, hands clasped, face calm, as if she had just laid the first stone on a path that couldn't be turned back. In that room, the air grew heavier by the minute, but it was no longer fear, it was anticipation. People waited for answers, for a decision that would shift the balance, and everyone could feel it. After the question was just asked, no excuse would hold, only the raw truth standing face to face with justice. Kane was asked to stand and respond, his hands clutching the edge of the table, sweat streaming down his forehead, his back stiff as if he didn't know how to react. At first, he tried to maintain a tough appearance, but his trembling voice betrayed him entirely. We were just following procedure, the subject was acting suspicious." The words fell flat, broken, disappearing into the cold silence. Each time he tried to add another excuse, the cold stares in the room bore into him, making his voice even more disjointed. The entire explanation sounded less like a defense and more like a weak confession, revealing that he was being pushed to the point of collapse. Everyone on the committee remained silent, observing. Some sighed, others smirked. Kane lowered his head, his eyes darting repeatedly to the floor like a man imprisoned by dozens of piercing gazes. By now, the arrogant confidence he once flaunted on the street had vanished, leaving behind a small fumbling figure utterly unable to take control. A committee member leaned forward and pressed, "You call that maintaining order?" Kane was speechless, his mouth moving but no words coming out, his voice caught in his throat. The slight tremble in his shoulders cut deeper than any rebuttal. It showed the mask had shattered, and all that remained inside was emptiness. In contrast to that flustered display, Briggs still tried to maintain a laid-back posture, his eyes darting around the room as if to show he remained unfazed. When it was his turn, he cleared his throat, voice raspy from cigarettes, then began his rebuttal. "This is being blown out of proportion. We were doing our job, and those kids filming just wanted attention." The line came out sounding confident, but lacked any weight. No one in the room believed in that arrogance anymore because it was hollow, baseless, and only made his obstinacy more obvious. Briggs kept sitting upright, but his clenched fists, knuckles pale, betrayed the tension he tried to suppress. Maya stared directly at Briggs, the corner of her mouth lifting in a cold smile. She didn't need to interrupt, because the weakness in his defense exposed everything. Another committee member spoke sternly. "You call that truth when both the evidence and the witnesses contradict you?" Briggs turned away, lips tightly pressed together, still trying to throw out a defiant look. But that defiance had become a cracked mask, and no one was fooled by it anymore. The room fell into silence again, the cold white lights overhead making the air feel heavier. In that stillness, the contrast had never been clearer. Kane, trembling in fear, Briggs, rigid in hollow pride, both laying bare their failure. And after what had just transpired, the disciplinary committee no longer saw them as officers bearing a badge, but as men who had lost their way, exposed by the truth itself. The courtroom was steeped in tense silence, white lights pouring down from the high ceiling, making the space feel even colder. On the elevated bench, the judge sat upright, his face stern like it had been carved from stone, his gaze cutting through the room with unwavering intensity. The 2 rows of public seating behind were dead silent, not a single sound, because everyone understood that this moment would determine not just the outcome of a case, but the public's faith in justice itself. Thousands more watched, online eyes locked on the live feed, not missing a single detail. The air felt compressed, waiting for the moment to explode. Maya stepped into the center of the room, her shoes striking the cold stone floor with a decisive sound, each step carrying weight. She placed a thick file on the table, pulling out photos, videos, and witness statements, then presented them one by one into the light. "These are the facts." Her voice rang out clear and firm, not only of abuse of power, but of the public degradation of a citizen's dignity. The cameras zoomed in on each photo, the image of Marcus in handcuffs, his calm eyes raised toward the national flag, broadcast to millions. The witness statements were read aloud, each line cutting through prior excuses like arrows. The public, watching from outside, erupted with emotion, online comments surging in tidal waves. Kane sat on the witness stand, sweat dotting his forehead, hands clenched tightly together. As Maya's voice surged like an unstoppable current, he suddenly blurted out like a cornered man grasping for escape. "We thought he was just another black guy." The words dropped raw and vicious into the thick silence echoing across the courtroom. Every eye turned toward him, a mix of shock and outrage. A few whispers rose, but were quickly drowned by the crushing stillness. The judge scowled, slamming the wooden gavel down with a thunderous crack that silenced the entire room. The judge's stern eyes locked on Kane, sharp as a blade. The entire courtroom sank into breathless quiet, everyone aware they had just witnessed an unfiltered confession from a man with a badge and a soul steeped in prejudice. Maya stood still, lips pressed tight, her eyes drilling into Kane, but she didn't need to say anything more. The words he had just spoken became irrefutable evidence, the final puzzle piece completing the case. The public outside was in uproar. Comment sections on fire voices screaming in anger and others crying in frustration. In the courtroom, Marcus sat in the back, his eyes showing no anger, only the cold detachment of someone who had long understood exactly what he was facing. He didn't need to react because the truth had already spoken through the very mouth of the man who once tried to trample him. The entire room was silent, but it was no longer a silence of fear. It was the weight of truth that had just been fully exposed. And when the gavel struck again, everyone knew the scales of justice had tilted decisively, leaving no place for falsehood to hide. The words that had just escaped Kane's mouth sent shockwaves through the room. People in the gallery gasped in unison, chairs scraped against the stone floor, and murmurs rippled like crashing waves. Some covered their mouths in horror, others clenched their jaws in fury, while the reporters seized the moment, cameras flashing endlessly, bathing the courtroom in bursts of light. The uproar turned the once solemn space into a storm of noise. Immediately, the gavel slammed hard against the bench, the sharp crack bouncing off every wall, forcing the crowd into silence. The judge frowned, his face tense, eyes filled with both anger and disappointment. He stared directly at Kane, gaze piercing through the last remaining mask, and his voice rang out stern and final. Enough. The air thickened, leaving only the sound of shallow, rapid breaths from those caught in the storm. Behind them, the live feeds continued to broadcast, and viewers outside could feel the tremor spreading by the second. Kane's words were no longer a defense, but a knife that severed the last lifeline for both him and Briggs. The judge leaned forward, fingers interlocked, eyes fixed on the witness stand as if forcing them to confront what they had just laid bare before the public. Amid the chaos, Marcus sat still, his posture unwavering. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes stared ahead, cold and sharp as steel, quiet yet heavy enough to command the room's attention. There was no tremble in that gaze, only a silent declaration. Justice does not need to shout, it exists in every steady glance, in every unwavering moment. Marcus's calm presence became the counterweight to the uproar and anchor, keeping the trial from being swept away in the tide of emotion. Maya sat beside him, glancing briefly at her client, her lips pressed into a firm line. She knew he didn't need any defense right now because that calm composure had already become the most powerful indictment. Those watching the live stream could also see the contrast clearly. On one side, panic and incoherence. On the other, proud silence. The stark difference between the two left no doubt about where the truth stood. After several minutes of chaos, the courtroom settled back into silence. Not the silence of evasion, but of recognition. All eyes turned to Marcus as if finding in him a source of stability, a symbol of inner strength standing firm in the storm. While the judge maintained his stern expression, Marcus remained motionless, his gaze hard as steel, turning this moment into an image etched into memory, a reminder that justice, though trampled, still stands tall. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed sharply, each blow tearing through the heavy air in the courtroom. The judge sat upright, his gaze cold and resolute. After hours of hearing arguments and reviewing evidence, he finally spoke, his voice clear and ringing through the chamber. This court finds the defendants, Kane and Briggs, guilty of abuse of power and racial discrimination. Each word fell with weight, but also brought a sense of release to those present. The room erupted in that instant, some people crying, others applauding, while reporters rushed to send the news out to the world. The gavel struck again to restore order, but it couldn't drown out the cheering outside the courthouse. The thick wooden doors seemed powerless to block the surge of people rising beyond them. Hundreds of voices chanted in unison like a chorus. Justice for Marcus flags and banners waved in the sunlight, turning the plaza in front of the courthouse into a sea of fervor. They cheered not just for a verdict, but for having witnessed truth triumph over darkness. A rare moment when justice stepped out of the pages of law books and stood present in real life. Inside the courtroom, Kane hung his head, face pale, shoulders trembling. The arrogance he once flaunted had vanished, replaced by complete collapse. Briggs sat motionless, his face frozen, like stone eyes bloodshot from rage and bitterness. He gripped the arm of his chair tightly, but there was nothing left to resist. The defiant words he once threw out now echoed like foolish confessions, leaving behind a cold void in a man who once believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Maya sat still, hands resting on the case file, eyes on Marcus. She drew a deep breath, feeling the tension of the past days give way to relief. Marcus remained upright, his expression showing no joy, no need for applause or cheers. He simply nodded, as if the verdict was just a necessary step, a confirmation that truth had finally found its place. That look made it clear to all who saw him justice to him was not revenge, but a reaffirmation of human dignity in the face of abused power. The cheering outside did not stop. It spread further down streets, across news broadcasts, into every post on social media. The people felt they had helped mark a turning point, and those chants were not only for Marcus Reed, but for themselves, for the belief that the voice of the community could change what once seemed unchangeable. In that moment, the courthouse was no longer a sealed building, but a symbol of truth recognized in public view. When the judge struck the gavel for the final time, declaring the trial closed, everyone in the courtroom rose simultaneously. The sounds of chairs scraping back and footsteps echoing filled the space, but above all was the roar of cheers from outside, blending with the ringing of a nearby church bell. The whole city seemed to breathe in unison, witnessing the moment a verdict was delivered, and believing that justice, though delayed, could still arrive and illuminate even the darkest corners. Kane collapsed into his seat, head bowed, hair falling over half his face, shoulders trembling in defeat. The arrogant figure, once strutting through the streets or mocking others in a jail cell, was now nothing more than a broken shadow, a man drained of all resistance. Briggs was different. He remained upright, his face like stone eyes wide and fixed on the emptiness ahead. Not a muscle moved, but the weight of his silence revealed itself, as though the final layer of composure was straining to hold back the inner collapse. The pride he once wielded had become a cold wall, not built to intimidate, but to prevent himself from crumbling in public view. The courtroom settled into stillness, all murmurs and clicking shutters now focused on the two men who had just been judged. No one saw the same figures who had once barked threats at the public only. A tragic contrast remained, one man bowed in shame, the other frozen behind a hollow mask. The silence grew so heavy that even a sigh echoed through the room. All eyes turned toward them, not with pity, but with the certainty that this was the inevitable outcome of power abused to trample human dignity. Marcus sat in the front row, hands folded neatly, gaze steady. He didn't smile, didn't clap, and showed no sign of triumph. In his eyes was calm depth and a quiet glimmer. He understood this verdict was not revenge nor personal victory, but proof that justice, after being suppressed, had finally entered this room. His eyes looked beyond the chamber, as if sending a message. Justice does not exist to satisfy anger, but to prevent injustice from repeating itself. Maya looked over at Marcus, met his gaze, and felt her spine straighten, her chest lighten. She knew her client had never sought a private win, but always aimed toward something far greater. His composure made the cheering outside the doors ring like a shared anthem, where the community found its strength in believing once more in themselves. The courtroom gradually emptied, but the image of Marcus sitting in silence, his eyes sharp as steel, remained etched in everyone's memory. He sat there, needing no further defense, because his presence in that space alone spoke a singular truth: justice, even when trampled, can rise and exist despite every effort to bury it. And in that moment, more than any spoken word, was a reminder to the entire system that the light of justice is always waiting to shatter the dark. City Hall that day was brightly lit, every seat filled with reporters, activists, citizens, and even high-ranking officials. The low murmur of voices filled the room, a restless hum, hiding a tense anticipation as everyone waited for the official announcement. On the podium, the national flag fluttered gently from the ceiling fan's breeze, casting a solemn glow on the faces of the city's leaders. When the highest-ranking official stepped forward, the chatter instantly faded and the room fell into expectant silence. He adjusted the microphone, his voice clear and firm. "We are officially launching a comprehensive plan to reform the police department. This is our commitment to the public that violations will no longer be tolerated and the law must be placed above all." His words cut through the room like a gleaming sword, tearing down the old curtain and opening a new vision. Applause broke out from the front rows and rippled through the hall, a thunderous wave that shook the air. Reporters pointed their cameras and microphones directly at the podium, capturing every word. The live broadcast spread instantly across all media outlets, and within minutes, headlines flashed nationwide: "Government announces police reform." Outside in the plaza, where hundreds had gathered, early cheers erupted, flags waved, and banners rose high. The atmosphere surged, not just in anger anymore, but in belief that everything they had fought for was finally making a difference. Inside the hall, young officers seated to the left looked at one another, their eyes gradually lighting up. They were the ones who had seen the events unfold from the inside, who felt the crack when truth broke through, and today they saw a door to change opening. One of them stood clapping boldly, then called out, "We support reform. We want a police force that truly protects justice." His words spread like fire, prompting many others to rise and join in applause, their voices lifting in unison. The usual silence of formal meetings was shattered, replaced by voices speaking from the heart. The official on the podium looked down, nodding slightly, his eyes reflecting determination. He knew this younger generation would be the foundation of change, and their public support marked a shift could not be reversed. Maya, seated toward the back, watched the scene with rising emotion. The tense days, the sleepless nights spent preparing evidence had all led to this moment, and Marcus, standing quietly in the corner of the hall, said nothing, his gaze calm and deep as he surveyed the room. He didn't need to step up to the podium because his presence alone reminded everyone that this fight was never about one man, but about building a system that places humanity above the badge. Outside, the chants still echoed through every doorway, blending with the applause inside the hall to form a chorus of belief. Ordinary citizens, reporters, young officers, they had all come together to create a historic moment. And from that moment, the social consequence was clear. There was no more room for hollow arrogance, no more shadows to hide wrongdoing, because justice had finally been called by name before the entire community. The impact of the special press conference didn't stop at City Hall. It quickly spread across the nation. Major news outlets simultaneously released headlines in bold print, dominating digital front pages. "This is a historic turning point," wrote a veteran journalist on the front page with a firm tone that confirmed the reform decision was not just a political promise, but the direct result of a united community and a truth that could no longer be buried. The article was shared millions of times, becoming proof of a social awakening where people realized that a collective voice had forced the system to bow. On national television special, broadcasts followed one after another, analyzing the case and its wide-reaching effects. Images of Marcus Reed, his calm gaze in the courtroom, were chosen as the backdrop for many reports. The evening news opened with the line, "His name has become a symbol not only in this city, but across the country." Follow-up commentary confirmed that this event marked a moment when justice was no longer confined to cold legal documents, but brought into the light for all to witness. Across social media platforms, the name Marcus Reed appeared everywhere, attached to images, quotes, and hashtags. One user posted a photo of him raising his badge during the trial, captioned simply, "They arrested the police chief." Another chose his calm statement, "I need the truth," and added, "This is what the entire country needs." Every post, every comment was like like a small flame connecting to form a sea of light that spread not only nationally, but beyond borders. International news outlets also joined in publishing reports with striking headlines. A major newspaper ran the title, "Police Chief Arrested by His Own Officers, A Nation Questions Justice." A foreign TV network replayed the courtroom clip dozens of times a day, remarking that the event exposed the deep-rooted issue of racial bias in law enforcement. The name Marcus Reed appeared everywhere, from news broadcasts and political analyses to personal posts and public conversations. Inside the hall, reporters were constantly sending updates to their newsrooms' phones, ringing nonstop, a signal that stories had been published. A young journalist sitting in the back row kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, typing furiously, Marcus's words echoing in his head. "The law isn't your little game," he added to the closing lines of his piece. "In a society overshadowed by arrogance, sometimes a single unwavering gaze is enough to open a new era." That article spread overnight, making Marcus Reed's name shine even brighter as a symbol of awakening. Out in the square, the crowds still hadn't dispersed. They held up their phones, streaming live, joining the chants. Marcus Reed Justice echoed through every street, reaching the hearts of those who had once remained silent. And within that wave, the press's declaration that this was a historic turning point became reality, because never before had one person caused an entire nation to speak his name with such reverence and unwavering belief. Night had fallen over the city, the sky outside cloaked in dense black, with only a few streetlights casting their glow onto the glass window. In the high-floor office of the police department, silence filled the space, broken only by the warm light of a desk lamp illuminating a small corner where Marcus Reed sat. On the desk, police chief badge lay still, the polished metal reflecting the light in a sharp glint, both solemn and heavy. Marcus reached out and lifted the badge, gazing at it for a long time before allowing a faint smile to cross his lips, not of triumph or pride, but like the exhale of someone who had emerged from the abyss and now stood before the symbol of the responsibility he carried. His eyes dimmed as memories surged, pulling him back to the night before. That night, the sound of sirens tore through the darkness as red and blue lights flashing like blades, slicing the air. The chill of the handcuffs clamping onto his wrists, Kane's sneering laugh, Briggs's contemptuous tone, all of it returned in vivid detail. Marcus remembered every sound, every look, even the way he was dragged out before the crowd like a trophy. The humiliation hadn't broken him, but it left a mark deep in his mind, a reminder that truth must often endure brutal trials before being acknowledged. In the quiet room, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his hand still gripping the badge, his fingers brushing across the engraved letters. He felt its weight, not just metal, but the weight of a community's trust. Outside, his name was being chanted. The media was calling this a historic turning point, but he knew this was only the beginning. A faint smile flickered, yet his eyes remained sharp as steel, filled with resolve. In his mind, Briggs's voice echoed, "Around here, the law is whatever this stick says." And that very sentence became the spark that reminded Marcus that the road ahead wasn't for basking in recognition, but for proving that the law is justice, not a tool for the powerful. Outside the window, the city glowed with light. Traffic still murmured below, but inside the room was the stillness of a man facing himself. Marcus knew he had just overcome one battle, but the real responsibility was only now beginning. He placed the badge back on the desk, his eyes fixed on its reflected light, and whispered like a vow, "The law must be justice." The words echoed in the empty room, heard by no one, but they would follow him like an oath, etched into every step he took along the road ahead where darkness still lingered, but light had begun to break through. The silence in the room was so complete that Marcus could hear every tick of the clock, yet in his mind an old sentence echoed, Briggs's voice still biding as if he were standing right in front of him. "Around here, we are the law." That cruel line rang out with every tick, drilling deep like a wound that hadn't healed, dragging back the memory of the night he was handcuffed. The image of red and blue lights smeared across the pavement, Kane's sneering laugh, the cold rapping of a baton, all blurred together, forming a portrait of power convinced of its own supremacy. Marcus sat still, eyes fixed on the police chief badge lying on the desk, the warm desk lamp casting a sharp glow across it like a constant, unshakable reminder. He understood, clearly, that Briggs's words weren't just an outburst from an arrogant man, but the echo of a system long accustomed to ruling through fear. The law wasn't aimed solely at him, it targeted everyone, viewed through the lens of bias. It was the shameless voice of years in which authority was used to bury the truth, twisting justice into a hollow shell. Marcus knew that if he bowed his head, if he stayed silent, that sentence would continue to live on, weighing down on every generation that followed. He lifted the badge, the cool metal seeping into his fingertips, while the fire in his chest blazed higher. His eyes reflected the lamp's golden light, sharp and unyielding like steel. He leaned slightly forward, lips pressed tight before releasing a whisper, slow but firm. The law must be justice. The words rang out in the quiet room, small yet heavy, like a vow etched in stone. In that moment, Marcus no longer saw Kane or Briggs, only the road ahead, long and demanding, where justice had to be rebuilt through transparency and accountability. Outside the window, the city glowed in its restless rhythm, the sounds of traffic blending with the night wind, but within the office, the silence had become something sacred. Marcus set the badge down, his eyes still locked on the light reflecting off the metal surface. He knew that from this moment on his responsibility was heavier than ever, not because of the title, but because of the eyes out there placing their trust in him. The vow he had just spoken wasn't for himself alone, but for the entire community, for those who had suffered injustice. A promise that justice would no longer be just a slogan, but something guarded by the power of truth. The grand square in front of the courthouse lit up like a sea of people, waves flowing in from neighborhoods, alleys, and suburban roads, carrying with them hand-painted signs scrawled in red painting, brushes, sweat, and fury. The sky was pale gray, the sun not yet harsh, but the heat of hundreds, then thousands of bodies pressed together made the air suffocating as chants thundered non-stop, blending with the sound of drums, whistles, and makeshift loudspeakers. Amid the crowd, young faces stood out clearly, eyes bright, holding up boards with messy yet resolute letters, "Justice for all." Each word was a red-hot arrow fired into the sky, cutting through the air, slamming into the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse behind them, where the fate of 2 officers had just been sealed. Elders stood at the front line, silver hair fluttering in the wind, eyes brimming with tears. They didn't need to say much, only nodded softly, trembling hands resting on the shoulders of the young around them. One elderly woman whispered, "At last, this day came." Someone finally stood tall. An old man tapped his cane to the rhythm of the chants, lips tight, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. For them, the image of Marcus standing tall in the courtroom wasn't just a symbol of truth, proof that the pain spanning generations had finally been carried by someone transformed into strength. In that sea of people, student groups kept live streaming voices carried through phones across screens reaching millions. "We're watching history," a young woman shouted into the camera. Behind her, a long line of signs fluttered in the wind. Online viewers flooded the comment sections, hearts racing, many from afar promising to take to the streets. The wave of outrage had broken beyond the city's limits, turning into a current linking people across regions, growing larger with every passing minute. The words "justice for Marcus" and "justice for all" flooded screens, splashed across international headlines and major news networks, making this moment impossible to bury in silence. From a high corner of the hall, Marcus quietly observed the scene through the glass, his gaze touching every face, every raised arm. He didn't need to speak, his presence alone gave the community faith that the truth was being protected. Maya stood beside him, feeling the weight of the wave outside her heart, both joyful and trembling, knowing that from this day forward the story was no longer just about a case, but had become the shared voice of a society. In the midst of roaring cheers and beating drums, belief in justice ignited like a flame burning bright under the city sky, spreading from the young to the old, from this small square to the entire nation. Marcus stepped out of the hall, the heavy wooden doors closing behind him, and was immediately swallowed by the rising tide of people like a wave. The midday sun poured over the square, lighting up hundreds of flushed faces, sweat streaming down but eyes still burning bright. People were no longer just watching. They pressed forward, raising signs boards marked with the words "Justice for All" slicing up into the sky like blades. Chants erupted in waves echoing across the space, turning the square into a unified force of fury and conviction. Marcus walked through the crowd, his steps slow, saying nothing, making no grand gestures, letting the quiet weight of his presence blend into the roar of thousands. He didn't speak, but his gaze said more than words could. Each step on the pavement, each strike of his shoes joined the rhythm of the shouting, becoming the music of a morning writing itself into history. The crowd parted as he passed, no one daring to cut ahead, all seemingly in silent agreement that this was a moment to be honored. A young woman raised a board, the golden letters scribbled in uneven strokes, "Justice for All." Her smile, streaked with tears, made others around her fall silent. They looked at Marcus at that steady stride and saw themselves in him, saw the forgotten years now returned as new-found hope. From another corner hand, drums beat out a rhythm, strong and fast like the pounding heart of the crowd. A group of students shouted hoarsely, voices worn from hours of yelling, "Justice for Marcus, justice for all." The wave of sound crashed against the stone walls of the courthouse and bounced back into the square, echoing through the city streets. The chants grew louder, merging with footsteps, claps, and syncopated beats, creating an unstoppable pressure. And when the church bell across the street suddenly rang, even that sound was drowned beneath the roar, as if the entire city were delivering its own verdict, a judgment of conscience. Marcus lifted his head, his eyes sharp, calm. He didn't need to give a speech, didn't need fiery words, because each silent step told the crowd that justice had arrived. In that moment, as the chants overpowered the church bell, he felt certain he was no longer alone. Every voice calling his name touched the past, but also promised the future. And in the heart of that surging crowd, Marcus Reed walked forward, his figure steady like a monument, leaving behind those who once claimed to be the law, now standing silent in the ruins of the power they once believed unshakable. The lecture hall of the police academy, usually echoing with the steady rhythm of boots, dry recitations, and repetitive reports like ritual, now buzzed with an unusual energy. On the large screen behind the podium, the infamous clip played again in full sound, from the piercing sirens and mocking whistles to Marcus Reed's calm gaze as he was handcuffed and dragged away. The projector's light fell across the wooden rows, illuminating the faces of young cadets sitting silently, eyes wide, missing no frame. Every cruel word from Kane, every arrogant gesture from Briggs, every second. Marcus lifted his head toward the glowing flag, seemed etched into their minds until the spacious room suddenly felt suffocating. The older instructor stood by the screen, his face lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes stern but quietly pained. He let the clip finish uninterrupted, allowing each cadet to confront the harsh truth directly. When the final image faded, the room's lights blinked back on. He picked up a piece of chalk, tapped it against the board, and spoke slowly. "This isn't just a violation, it's a lesson in dignity." The words echoed through the vast hall, their weight snapping some cadets upright as if shaken from their naivety. A long silence followed, and within it, everyone could feel the heavy presence of that single word, dignity. Young eyes began to sharpen with determination. A cadet, seated mid-row, clenched his pen and whispered to the person beside him, "If they did did that to an innocent man. What kind of person will I become when I'm out there in uniform? His friend face, resolute, nodded firmly, eyes blazing. At the back of the room, another group murmured in tense debate. One slammed a hand on the desk in frustration, another quietly jotted down every word. The academy, once subdued, had become a crucible of thought where every young heart was beginning to awaken. The instructor looked around, his voice lowering but growing firmer. Tomorrow, some of you will wear this badge. Remember, it is not a shield from accountability. It does not place you above others. It places you beside them to protect them. Look at Marcus Reed's eyes in that clip. Those are the eyes of a man who believed in the law to the very end, even as he was dragged through the night. The hall fell completely silent. Each cadet sat upright, eyes fixed on the now dark screen, still seeing the image of the man holding that gleaming badge. And in that silence, the seeds of reform began to sprout, small but strong, like shoots breaking through dry soil after a storm, promising one day to become a forest that shelters an entire community. White notebook pages flipped rapidly, and the scratching of ballpoint pens rang out like a tense chorus throughout the lecture hall. The long wooden benches were packed with cadets, all hunched over writing while glancing up at the images projected from the clip. On their young faces, innocence was gradually replaced by solemnity, their eyes bright with fury and a hunger for change. A young man slammed his pen onto the page, whispering to himself, "I'll never let that scene happen under my watch." Beside him, a girl carefully wrote each word, her hand trembling but her eyes steady, as if carving an oath into the page. From the back rows came soft murmurs, not idle chatter, but the sound of heated debate. If it were us in that situation, would we have the courage to speak up? One voice asked, drawing many glances. Another answered, bitter but firm. No one's born to oppress. Either we stand with justice, or we become shadows of the Briggses and Kanes. The words froze the whole row, then pens resumed moving faster, harder, as if every word written was an arrow pointed toward the future. At the podium, the old instructor watched quietly, his eyes reflecting both hope and reflection. Over the years, he'd seen many classes graduate, put on uniforms, and get absorbed into the old machine, slowly losing the ideals they once carried. But today, he sensed something different. The atmosphere in the hall was no longer routine. Those determined eyes looked like seedlings freshly watered, promising to grow into strong trees, capable of resisting the shadows of injustice. He tapped the chalk gently on the board and wrote the word dignity in a shaky but firm hand, then turned to the class. "You must remember, strength isn't in the baton. It's in how you treat people. If you forget that the badge on your chest is nothing more than a piece of cold metal." His words echoed, carried by the unwavering gazes of hundreds of young eyes. Outside the lecture hall, the wind picked up, whipping the large flag on the field so fiercely it sounded like the breath of an entire city in transformation. From pages still fragrant with fresh ink from the solemn nods of cadets who had never yet set foot on a crime scene, the seeds of reform began to sprout. They were not yet trees, not yet ready to shade a society ablaze with unrest, but everyone could feel it in this very moment. A new generation of police officers was taking shape, driven by the desire to place justice above every false symbol of power, guided by the unwavering gaze of Marcus Reed. That night, City Hall glowed like a lighthouse in a sea of people, hundreds of electric lights casting beams onto the tall walls where a special exhibition about the case was held. On the main wall, a photo of Briggs's frozen face during the trial was placed inside a large wooden frame, illuminated by stark white lights that made his bewildered eyes and tightly pressed lips appear in sharp detail, like a painful etching that couldn't be erased. Everyone passing by stopped stopped, some stared silently, some pointed and whispered to their children, others lingered and thought before walking away. The photo needed no long explanation. That stunned expression had become a vivid testament to the collapse of a false belief. Just below the photo, a black plaque was neatly displayed on a polished wooden base. Bold, white letters etched across it. No skin color stands outside the law. The words, cut, cold, and clean, silencing all excuses, turning the entire space into a public acknowledgement of truth. A group of high school students came through still holding their textbooks, eyes wide as they read each word, then turned to ask the teacher beside them, "It means everyone should be treated fairly, right?" The teacher nodded gently, voice steady. "Yes, justice doesn't choose a skin color. Justice belongs to everyone." The young eyes looked at one another, lit with new belief, as if their minds had just opened to a wider future. In another corner, elderly people stood in small clusters looking at the photo, then at each other. A frail, older woman gripping a cane whispered, "We've waited too long for this day." A tear rolled down her cheek, the smile on her lips shone with quiet brilliance. A middle-aged man beside her nodded, his voice hoarse with emotion. At last, someone stood up for us. These hushed words passed through the crowd from ear to ear until they swelled into waves of applause. The clapping rose into the chants outside the square. Each beat a reminder of one truth: a new era was beginning. Reporters crowded in front of the photo's camera flashes, firing non-stop. They typed frantically, bold headlines appearing almost instantly. An image that redefines justice, the collapse of false power. The articles spread rapidly across social media, turning that frozen face into a symbol of failure, while Marcus Reed's name was invoked as the man who reawakened belief. Online comments poured in. One read, "This isn't an end, it's the beginning of a new future," while another added, "One photo strong enough to shake a generation." The reach of the exhibition went far beyond the hall, weaving its way into every home, every cafe, every lit apartment. In a shadowed corner, Marcus Reed stood quietly observing it all. He didn't approach the photograph, didn't step into any camera's view, and made no move to draw attention to himself. The light from the white plaque beneath Briggs's photo cast a glow onto his face, deepening the gravity in his eyes. He read the words, "No skin color stands outside the law," and felt that it was no longer a slogan, but a truth the community had carved with their own hands. A strange feeling stirred inside him, part relief, part sorrow, because reaching this moment had cost wounds that would never fully heal. Marcus turned away and walked slowly out of the exhibition hall, his figure blending into the crowd without a single word. But that very silence made his steps echo like a midnight bell ringing far and deep in everyone's heart, leaving behind an unshakable legacy that justice may be delayed, but it cannot be extinguished, and that the courage to confront injustice is the foundation that keeps a society from collapsing into darkness. The stream of visitors continued to enter City Hall. The grand hall that night lit brilliantly by white lights, footsteps echoing off the polished stone floor. The formal space, once filled with stacks of dry legal documents, had become a vivid exhibition where every photograph and line of text carried the weight of history. At the center of the large wall, the photo of Briggs's frozen face in the moment he heard the verdict was placed in a dark wooden frame, its gold trim emphasizing the emptiness in his stare. Those passing by slowed down, some tilted their heads, others squinted as if trying to peer deeper into the stunned look in his eyes. A natural hush fell over the room, not from confusion, but because the truth laid bare before them demanded silence. Beneath the photo stood a solid black plaque with crisp white lettering. "No skin color stands outside the law." The line cut like a cold blade slicing through the long muted wall of silence. A group of school children in uniform, books still in hand, stopped to read. One young boy stared at the words for a long time before softly asking, "Miss, does that mean everyone has to be protected?" The teacher beside him nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Yes, the law exists to protect all of us, and no one has the right to use skin color as an excuse to harm." Her answer planted more belief into their young minds, and their eyes lit up with a new hope that the world could become a fairer place. On the other side of the hall, the elderly stood together quietly, gazing at the photo and sighing. An old woman slowly raised her thin hand, gently running her fingers across the white letters on the plaque, her eyes blurred with tears. "We've lived through so many years, and finally we hear these words," she said, her voice choked. Those nearby lowered their heads, and a few young people stepped forward to support her. Then they too turned to read aloud each word on the plaque, their voices rising in the air. "No skin color stands outside the law." The reading spread, turning into a rhythm, a shared declaration of the entire community, shaking the space with collective resonance. Journalists crowded in front of the photographs, cameras clicking non-stop, white flashes bursting in rapid succession. A young female reporter looked up at Briggs's photo, then typed quickly on her laptop screen. In this moment, an entire system was exposed. That frozen face no longer represents power, but is proof of its collapse when faced with the truth. Her article was immediately published on the front page, accompanied by a photo of Marcus holding up the shining badge. On social media, thousands shared it with the caption, "Today we won with the truth." As the crowd continued to gather, the air in the exhibition hall thickened with layered emotion. Some people cried from joy. Others fell silent, remembering old wounds, while a few laughed aloud as if finally freed from a long-standing burden. Every gaze that paused to read the white letters beneath Briggs's photo carried depth, a reflection on the past and a hope for the future. They knew this story would be passed on not just through the press or social media, but through the collective memory of a community that once stood together and prevailed. In a quiet corner, Marcus Reed still stood silently, his figure blending into the yellowish light of a nearby display lamp. He stared long at the photo, eyes steady and calm, as if weighing pride against sorrow. He understood that what had unfolded wasn't a reward for himself, but a response to all the souls who had fallen to the cries for justice, once silenced in the dark. Marcus turned, walking slowly toward the exit, leaving no words behind, allowing the square outside to continue roaring. And in that very silence, with eyes hard as steel, he left in the people's minds a lasting legacy that justice does not reside in a badge, but in the courage to face injustice, and that only when the community rises with one voice does the story truly end, opening a new chapter in history where belief in justice is forever etched into every heart. Through the high glass window, the city wore its glowing coat of countless electric lights, the streams of traffic moving quietly back and forth as if no storm of public outrage were surging beyond. Marcus Reed stood upright, arms crossed in front of his chest, the police chief badge gleaming gold under the desk lamp, casting a glow over the firm lines of his face. Within him, memories played in reverse like a reel of film from the night he was forced to pull over the siren, slicing through the dark, the cold humiliation in every word thrown at him, to that moment in the courtroom when truth was finally laid bare. Each image returned not to reopen wounds, but to remind him of the price of silence and the necessity of courage. He recalled the moment Briggs slammed the table, growling, "Around here we are, the law," remembered Kane's pale face as he blurted out his own prejudice, remembered the fiery eyes of young officers in the meeting room when someone finally stood up for the truth. Those fragments didn't blur together, but stacked neatly, layer upon layer, building a different kind of wall, a wall of belief that justice still had a place. Marcus knew from now on no badge could twist wrong into right, no baton could drown out the voice of conscience. He whispered as if to himself, but also for millions, justice doesn't live in a badge. It lives in the courage to face injustice. Marcus. Meanwhile, out in the square the chants still roared, wave after wave, crashing up to the upper floors, reaching the window where Marcus stood. Cries of justice for all echoed, blending with the pounding of drums and the surge of marching feet, louder than even the ringing church bells. The elderly nodded, eyes brimming the young, raised their signs high, their eyes ablaze with belief. Marcus Reed's name had now gone beyond city lines, dominating national headlines, becoming the symbol of a transformation unlike any before. Marcus didn't turn to receive the applause. He stood still, watching in silence. In that stillness, he understood the crowd wasn't calling his name. They were calling out for justice. If once they had bowed their heads, resigned to live under the shadow of fear, now every chant was proof of awakening. He needed no personal victory, because the true triumph didn't belong to one man, but to the entire community when they reclaimed their voice, when they realized they held the power to force the truth to speak. The window stood wide open, and the night wind swept in, carrying with it the roar of cheers and the echoes of song. Marcus looked down at the square, saw faces glowing under the lights, saw hands raised high, saw belief passed from one person to the next. He nodded gently, then slowly left the office, walking in silence. No declaration, no applause. He let the city write the next lines of its own story. And when the door closed behind him, Marcus Reed's story closed with it. But the legacy he left behind remained burning quietly within the community like a flame of justice that would never go out. It was late. The city sky was stained with the yellow haze of streetlights mixed with neon glowing from the towering buildings. In the high-rise office, everything was so still that the sound of a pen falling onto the desk echoed like the beat of some invisible rhythm. Marcus Reed stood by the large window, his silhouette cast on the wall by the desk lamp. In his hand lay the police chief badge, gleaming and heavy. He stared at it for a long time, a cold glint in his eyes, then allowed himself a faint smile, part bitter, part calm. To many, the badge was the pinnacle of power, but to him, it was only proof that justice could be redefined from the very scars left behind by the past. In the silence, memories came rushing back like a fierce flood. Marcus clearly saw that dark night again, the red and blue lights slicing through the fog, the sirens tearing open the sky, the cold metal of the handcuffs tightening around his wrists. He heard again Kane's mocking laugh, Briggs's guttural threats, each word cutting like a blade. Then the image shifted back to the courtroom where the judge's gavel struck with finality, where Kane lowered his head, and where Briggs sat frozen, his face stiff as stone. Each memory rose sharp and unblurred, carved deep into his mind, forcing him once more to confront what Briggs had once said. The chilling words, "Around here we are the law." Marcus opened his eyes, staring out at the city lit with countless lights, where tens of thousands still packed the square, shouting calls for change. In his whispered voice, there was no anger, no resentment, only a steel-like calm. Justice doesn't live in a badge. It lives in the courage to face injustice. He knew those shiny badges, if turned into tools of oppression, were nothing more than soulless pieces of cold metal. What mattered wasn't rank or title, but the bravery to stand up, to stare into the darkness and speak the truth. That, and only that, was what kept a society from falling into the abyss. Outside in the square, the storm of public outrage continued to rise. Flags fluttered in the night wind, white banners stood out with bold red letters, and the chants of justice for all thundered across the space. Church bells on the corner began to ring, their echoes resonating for a moment before being drowned out by the roaring voices of the crowd. Every shout, every beat of the drums, every tear that fell shook the square, turning it into a gathering place for the power of thousands of hearts beating as one. Marcus looked down from the high-rise window, his gaze sweeping slowly but steadily across the sea of people, as if to imprint every face, every chant into memory. He didn't step out to speak, didn't raise a fist to rally the crowd, because he knew well that his words in the courtroom had already said enough, that the truth had spoken for itself. Now, the echoes within the hearts of the people were the strongest affirmation. He stood still, letting the chants and the drums outside crash rush in, letting his heartbeat sync with the march of the crowd. The final chapter didn't close with a promise, but with a belief that had already taken root in the heart of the community. From the night he was pulled over to the tense courtroom, from Marcus's calm gaze to the hollow collapse of those who once stood arrogant, all had become the foundation of a legacy. People understood that justice isn't something held by a few with badges, but a shared power of the community, a courage to confront injustice, and a resolve to hold on to the truth. As the city lights reflected off the glass, as the chants drowned out the church bells, a new era began, leaving future generations with the faith that justice is and that there will always be someone willing to stand up and protect it to the end. The city, deep into the night, had yet to quiet down. Echoes from the square still reached the tall windows where Marcus Reed stood. The yellow light from the desk lamp cast his shadow, and the police chief badge onto the surface, highlighting the lines etched deep by time and wounds still unhealed. In that moment of stillness, he let the memories flood back, every detail from the instant he was forced to stop on the avenue, the red and blue lights slashing through the night, to the suffocating hours in the holding cell, the sharp clang of batons on metal bars and the mocking whistles. He saw Kane's face crumble like wrinkled paper, saw Briggs try to keep his cold facade, even as his eyes gave him away, and he remembered clearly the gavel striking in the courtroom, echoing like thunder. All these fractured memories layered upon one another, no longer as burdens, but as permanent marks in the journey of a man who chose to seek the truth. To Marcus, the verdict that day wasn't a personal victory. It was confirmation that the law had escaped the hands of the arrogant. When the judge read the conviction, he felt no glee, no sense of vengeance, only a clear realization justice had at last stepped onto a higher platform and looked everyone squarely in the eye. That was the moment he understood more than ever that justice doesn't lie in badges, but in the courage to face injustice and the daring to speak up when everyone else remained silent. His steady calm, the way he raised his head under the cold light of the courtroom, spoke louder than any defense. Outside, as the church bells pealed, the crowds surged in force, chanting "Justice for all" louder than ever, as if washing away every remnant of falsehood. Elderly people wept in relief to finally see the light they'd waited so long for. Young students held up their phones, capturing every moment to share far and wide. On social media, millions of posts appeared. Images of Marcus's steady gaze or Briggs's hollow expression became powerful symbols of two opposing worlds. National news outlets labeled it a historic turning point, and international agencies echoed the story, ensuring it traveled beyond borders. After the trial, Maya walked out alongside Marcus, her heart filled with complex, indescribable emotions. She remembered that first meeting in the paperwork-strewn office when he quietly said, "I need the truth." That simple line had become a banner uniting tens of thousands. She understood that her work had grown beyond a single case. Today, she hadn't just defended a client. She defended the idea of fairness itself. In her eyes, Marcus had transformed from a wrongfully accused man into a beacon of resilience, a living symbol affirming that justice can prevail. In the minds of the people, this story would be told over and over, etched deeply as a lesson. It didn't end with the verdict, nor quiet down once the square emptied. It would live on in conversations, classrooms, and news pages. Young voices wrote down Marcus's words, turning them into slogans for discussion groups, passing them on as foundational lessons in dignity. Elders saw them as answers to years of disrespect, proof that perseverance and integrity can still bring results. The story of Marcus Reed ends here, but its echoes do not. It becomes a reminder that in a society filled with injustice, any individual can become a torch as long as they dare to stand tall and face it. Justice is not something something handed down from above, but something built from the courage of those willing to speak up. And in that moment, when the chants drowned out the sound of church bells, the city seemed to breathe as one, every heart beating to the same rhythm. The courtroom doors may have closed, but this story lives on, becoming a legacy within the community, reminding them that the truth will always find a way into the light, and that justice, once defended by faith and unity, will never be lost.